All right, so I guess I had wanted to talk about the series anyway, but when someone just was asking me about, I was explaining why I couldn't read the series as I gone back into it, and you can see behind me that's Drizzt Du Erdin. That's a character from a Forgotten Realm series. A series that's been out for a long time. I first got exposed to it like back in like '87, right? When I was a teenager and got into the books and it was a great series, right? Great character, a character I'm very fond of, and I recently introduced this character back into like my versus world, right? So it shows how much fondness I have for the character overall. And as we were having our conversation, this person asked me, because I said I tried to go back into reading this series because I was going to do like a breakdown on it, and I just couldn't get into the story anymore. And the question was why couldn't I? And I guess the simple answer is because when I first read this series, I was 15 years old, right? And through those lenses, it's where I'm reading the story from. Now I'm 52 years old. Okay, so we got a significant gap between like when I first got exposed to this series and right now. So what I found is some of the concepts in the story, whether intended by the author or not, manifested itself in how I was seeing the story. The first thing was this is a story, if you're not familiar with it, about a dark elf who lives in, this is a Dungeons and Dragons type of world that he lives in. He ends up going on this adventure, and it's all about these four different types of species getting together. He's hanging out with the barbarian. I'm sure there's a dwarf there, and they encounter some other stuff. And obviously, him being a dark elf, he lives on the surface now. So he's a dark elf who lives on the surface, and he stands out specifically because of his skin. Right? He's a dark elf, so he's highly identifiable, and he has, he always reveals himself to have this amazing character, right? Despite what people initially think about him, he always exceeds what people's beliefs about him were. So that's generally his story, in a nutshell. The backstory on this, of course, is his own culture, where he comes from, which is the Dark Elves themselves, right? And the Dark Elves themselves are really a very destructive culture, right? Where he comes from is very destructive. Now, I'm gonna say first. Now, the A. Salvatore, I believe, is the guy who wrote the book. Salvatore, I know the last name is Salvatore, who wrote the book, and he himself is, again, this is a story ultimately about someone who's discriminated against because of their color of their skin or their race or however you want to call it. Being a person, growing up in the United States, right? I could see that, right? There's parallels that I could see there, whether you see it or not. Obviously, the author of this is not a dark skinned person. He's not dark like this elf or myself. So obviously, he may not have intended for someone of my background to see a kinship in the story, but I did, right? Because the circumstances or settings of the book. Like no matter what, we're talking about someone who's dealing with discrimination based on their skin tone happens to be a dark skin tone. Someone who's actually living that in real life on some levels would automatically identify with this. So there are some subtle similarities, whether intended by the author or not. I'm not putting this on the author. To further exacerbate that situation, right? He carries with him some panther symbolism. You can see he's there rolling with the panther, and obviously we know also someone in my situation culturally. This is post Black Panthers era, right? I was born in the early '70s, so my mother and my father were, active or conscious or growing in adulthood as the Panthers were really active. So that was a heavy influence. So Panther influence in the African American culture is tied to not just through the political group, but if we go back into more African history, there's all this African symbolism, right? We can go all the way back. The Black Panther revealed a lot of it. Bastet, right? Sekhmet, Hathor, right? Oh, there are so many cat representations and panther representations in African culture and African American culture, right? It's just something ingrained. I remember like my uncle had a panther tattoo on his arm. Without even referencing or being in tune with that, I got a panther tattoo myself, right? I don't know if you've seen, I've done a couple like panther head charms. So panthers are very cultural right? Whether the author is mindful of this or not. So it created this idea of this kinship to this character, who I did see him as a high morals character, right? That's what he is. He goes out, he's always the hero, and extremely cool, right? He's very gifted, is great. You know, for this type, if you're into this type of genre of books, like, you're gonna love this character, right? He's the epitome of that. So I see this. So the backstory again, he comes from this dark skin culture, this black elf culture, and they're underground, right? So now, fast forward to me not being able to have a connection with the story. Fast forward to now, I see this community, and they're dark elves, and they live underground. Well, that automatically, I know we're in a fantasy world, but the rules of sunlight and skin color, to me, this is where the first flip, the first thing I could not accept. And I accept fantasy stories all the time, but I couldn't accept the story of the dark elves who live underground, because we understand the association with dark skin and the sun. So it was starting to mess with me there. It got a little bit out of hand. And then, of course, he comes from a matriarch society, and they're brutal. So again, I'm not questioning what the writer's intentions are, but I'm saying that he referenced a lot of tools that, under certain circumstances, can be confused or interpreted this way. That's really what I say. How it's interpreted. Like, we all know the Catcher in the Rye. There's a massive difference in how some people interpret the Catcher of the Rye, right? And again, they're just you're gonna react on what's there, or what you perceive as there, often through the lenses of what your culture is. So this is where I find myself with this. Is now I'm seeing these cultural similarities, right? And if I take it from the standpoint that, okay, what you're saying is that, and I didn't call him black. He's not black. I mean, he's an elf. He's not a black man. He's not cultural, but he's representing the idea of race or skin color being, whether they cast you as a hero or not. It's still the backdrop. It's still the kind of the impetus that kind of molds your whole story together, is the how, the why. Why is it that when you come to the surface world, you have to prove yourself, and people are surprised by that? There's a whole backstory and a psychology that goes with that, and I feel like it represented something that, a lot of, people who live in a minority culture, whether your skin is black or brown or yellow or red, right? You're going to experience the same type of thing. So it is a more of a melanated skin, like someone who has melanin or dark color to the skin would be a common understanding, or how we be perceived by this character, and the desire to be a hero there. So as I got older, obviously I'm seeing like how they represent the culture a little bit different. If we're saying this is a culture of dark skin, that's a bad culture, what are you then saying about, like, it is symbolic. That's your only representation of black culture, or excuse me, of a dark skin culture. So I have to believe that that's what you think, that's what you envisioned when you sat down and wrote it. And if you look about the matriarch part of it, what that also says, if you're in that same line of thinking, which again, I'm saying, let's just simply understand why a person would think like that, given their cultural heritage. And the author not sharing that same cultural heritage probably didn't interpret these things that he was doing the same way, and may have interpreted them in a completely different way, maybe even a more enlightened way. I'm not sure, because I can't understand what his viewpoint. So when I combine all those things together, and then I look at this character, I don't see him as a hero anymore. Because ultimately what he did was he walks away from his flawed, damaged culture and doesn't stay and fight for it, right? You have great ability, great skills. There are people within your culture, in your kingdom, that you knew were good people, that were, like, he had like a master that trained him or whatever, right? So it's difficult, because we Superman doesn't run from fights, right? Like, there's not a thing that got Superman down where he walked away from it, right? He handled every obstacle that was in front of him, including the first obstacles that were in front of him, right? So that's kind of our archetype for heroes, that we set. And so for him to say, I come from a flawed place, I have loved ones here, and I'm not going to fix this circumstance for them, or die trying, because, right, that's like, not every hero actually won. There's a lot, history is littered with heroes that did not win their war, even when they knew they were overwhelmed, right? Even when they knew that their chances weren't good, that's what made them the heroes, that they endeavored no matter what. So while I still see Drizzt as, like, a very cool character, the magic, scimitars, all that stuff is incredible, I just am not able to see him as a hero, and that's something that, a big difference. And again, the story didn't change. The story is exactly the same. I love the story when I was 15. I thought it was great, and I wanted to hang on and renew that feeling. It was not possible, because I've changed over time. in ways that are probably pretty predictable. If me knowing myself, it's very predictable ways that I change. But anyway, I just wanted to answer that question. I hope I did a thorough job. I did love the series. I wished, when I picked it up again, I was really hoping to get back into it because it was one of the best characters. I had shared the series with my uncle, so it was like, man, I had been reading, I've been messing with the series. I think it was going to be like the third time I read it. But anyway, I hope that answers your question. Again, thanks for stopping in. Please hit the like and subscribe, and we'll talk about more mythology and like fantasy stories and stuff.